Alright, ladies and gents, welcome back to Psych 345. This is our first lecture on the social self. So, just like last time, we're going to be looking at the slide content, then we're going to move into the textbook stuff, and I'll kind of gleam over it, find things that I think could be of use, and we'll go forward from there. So, to start, the social self, right? That's what this topic's all about, the social self. So what's the core idea? Right, the chapter, what we were looking at in class, it asks a deceptively simple question. The question essentially is, who am I? Social psychology frames the self not as fixed or purely internal, but as something that's shaped by observation, feedback, and social interaction, right? The four broad areas that organize the topic here, the social self topic, is self-perception, or learning about ourselves by observing our own behavior; self-presentation, or deliberately shaping how other people see us; self-comparison, which would be evaluating ourselves by comparing with others; and self-esteem, which is how much we like and value ourselves. So again, social psychology frames the self not as fixed or purely internal, but shaped by observation, feedback, and social interaction. And the four broad areas that kind of organize this idea of the social self are self-perception, self-presentation, social comparison, and self-esteem. All of these processes interact, right? How we think others see us can change what we do. What we do can inform what we think we're like, and comparisons and self-esteem can color both, right? None of these things are mutually exclusive. So let's get into it, right? We have our kind of conceptual basis for what the chapter is going to be about. Let's get a little specific. So we're going to look at Charles Horton Cooley's 1902 study on the looking glass self, or his terminology, his terming of the looking glass self. We are looking at the looking glass self. So, with all that nonsense aside, what's the concept here, right? The concept of the looking glass self is that we internalize how we think others judge us and integrate those appraisals into our self-concept. So, the looking glass self, again, it would be pretty much, I am what I think you think I am, right? We internalize how we think others judge us. We internalize how we think other people judge us, and then we integrate those judgments into our self-concept. We use other people as a mirror for ourselves that we look at. Again, it's this tendency to internalize other people's judgment about us and integrate them into our self-concept. If we're told we're a kind person, and we think other people think we're a kind person, we're more likely to believe that we are a kind person, right? It's all about that reflection. The evidence for this was produced in a study by Miller, Brickman, and Bolin in 1975. The design is they set up 3 fifth-grade Chicago classrooms, and they held an 8-day intervention. They had three kind of groups. Like I just said, three classrooms. In one, they used a labeling and attribution condition. So these kids, in one condition, were repeatedly told that they are neat and tidy. Not that they should be, but that they are. Again, one group was told that they are neat and tidy. The second group, the second class, was the persuasion condition. They were told that they should be neat and tidy. Not that they are, but that they should be. And then we had the control condition, right? They were given no special messaging. They were just allowed to continue as usual. So, what was measured was the rate at which these kids litter and clean up after themselves before the test and before the groups were established. 2 days after the test and the introduction of the labeling, and 2 weeks after the test, right? Substantially longer. Again, in this case, littering was the dependent variable. The independent variable, littering was the dependent variable. The littering was dependent. It was the labeling that was independent. So again, that's just for some terminology review. The labeling is what would be changed to see the effect on the littering, the dependent variable. So how did this look in practice now that we have our broad understanding? Essentially, they gave kids chocolate and candies wrapped in wrappers and counted how many wrappers made it into the garbage versus the wrappers that didn't. They repeated this treatment, this evaluation. They repeated this test. Again, this checking of wrappers ending up in the garbage before the treatment, so before the test happened, right after, again, just like before, we said that they did it 2 days post, so right after, they immediately did it post-test, and also they did it well after, just like we said, 2 weeks post. So they repeated this testing at these 3 separate intervals for these 3 separate groups. Just a note, again, we had looked at pre-testing for a second there. They, right before the treatment, they tested just to establish the sort of the standardized nature of the variable. We don't always do that, right? We don't always do pre-tests, but in this case, we do it because there can be a lot of confounding variables in the teachers in the classroom. There are things like outside of our scope conditions that would otherwise like to be controlled, that we can't really establish for as the baseline unless we pre-test. So it's kind of just about covering your bases, if all of your bases need to be so drastically covered for. But anyway, again, I think we have a good understanding of the setup for the experiment, how the experiment looked. Let's look at the findings. So all the kids were equally messy and clean before the test, before the treatment. Messy/clean before the test, before the treatment. Right after, so the immediate post-test testing, we saw some difference. So right afterwards, kids that were told that they should and are neat, their neatness both went up. But the kids who were told that they are neat, not should be, but are, their neatness went way up. However, over time, those labels that they are neat and tidy maintained, while those that were told that they should be, it kind of tapered off after the, when we did the 2-week evaluation. So the kids that were labeled as neat, not that they should be, they weren't encouraged, but the kids who were told that they are, they littered less both right after and 2 weeks later. Both of them did, but it's not really much of a significant difference when it comes to the kid who are told that they should be neat 2 weeks later. And we can see that in the graph here if you just want to look at the screen. So the idea here is that persuasion necessarily doesn't equate to control, right? It doesn't necessarily have a lasting effect. Labeling, however, does feed self-concept, and behavior can change in response to labeling. Right? We like to behave in line with our self-perception. When we don't behave in line with our sense of self, we experience what's called cognitive dissonance. In that case, we have contradicting beliefs, or we do things that contradict how we think we should act. The hypocritical feeling of this, it feels icky, and we work to solve that. Dissonance is usually a result of personal noticing that behavior conflicts with value, that thought and behavior conflict, that behavior conflicts with feelings, whatever it may be. But that, again, this cognitive dissonance, this is what happens when we don't behave in line with our sense of self. So I think we have a pretty good understanding of the looking glass self there. Okay, so self-perception theory. Self-perception theory is the idea that we learn about ourselves the same way we infer others' traits. simply by observing behavior and context. Again, we learn about ourselves by observing our own behavior. That is the crux of self-perception theory. It's sort of contradictory when it comes to, contradicting the first theory. It's this system where, in order to determine what we believe and how we think, we observe our own behavior. It's less so about observing how other people view us. That's the key in the self-perception theory. Again, we observe our own behavior to learn about ourselves. So, in the same way that we might say, "My friend goes birdwatching all the time; she must like it," we must say, if I'm eating this food all the time, it must be because I enjoy it. It works best when our internal attitudes are weak or sort of ambiguous. If there's something that you're not fully sure how you feel about, even if this process is unconscious, you might look at your thoughts and feelings about it to determine how you actually do feel about it, even if beforehand you were relatively unsure. So that is the primary idea for the self-perception theory. Let's look at a study. So this was the Chaikin and Baldwin study. The setup here, essentially participants first pre-screened with a questionnaire for well-defined or poorly defined pro-environment attitudes. I apologize for the stuttering, but essentially what we mean by that is participants were screened with a questionnaire for well-defined, meaning a strong-held belief, so you're either pro or you're anti-environment, versus people that had poorly defined beliefs, so they were kind of mixed or they were inconsistent. So we have these groups. Then participants completed a second questionnaire, either focusing on their pro-environment action or on anti-environment action. So it's important to note here that half the participants completed the questionnaire designed to focus on their pro-environment actions, and other half did the opposite. Then a third questionnaire was given where people re-rated their attitudes. So again, they have a first screening where they rate their attitudes for well-defined or poorly defined attitudes. Then they do a second questionnaire where they focus either on pro or anti-environment actions, regardless of what their initial screening was determined to be. And then they did a third questionnaire rating their attitudes again. The results is that for the people that had poorly defined views, if they focused on pro-environment action, it led to their attitudes actually becoming more pro-environment. The opposite happened if they focused on anti-environment actions. This is a good example of priming, first of all, because they were primed with these ideas. But it's important to note that if you had initial attitudes that were well-defined, there wasn't really a change there. And this is, again, the implication here, just like we talked about. When we're unsure about our stance on a thing, we look at how we've acted, what we've done, how we feel, and we evaluate that, what we've said in the past, to decide what it is that we actually believe. That is self-perception theory. So we've looked at the core idea of the social self, we've looked at the looking glass self, and we've looked at self-perception theory. Let's look at the over-justification effect. So the idea here is that when an enjoyable activity gets tied to external rewards, we naturally will infer, generally at least, that we did it for that reward, not just for fun. Then intrinsic motivation drops. So we're looking at this concept of an intrinsic versus an extrinsic motivation, right? Extrinsic, that would be something like a reward. Intrinsic is essentially, it's self-driven. You're doing it for you. So for example, in my case, if we just want to apply this over-justification effect and its principles again, when an enjoyable activity gets tied to external rewards, we infer that we did it for the reward, not for fun. Then intrinsic motivation drops. When it comes to me, I'd think that if I play bass a lot, it's because I really like playing bass. There's no external pressure at all. But the thing is, if there was external pressure, and this would be things like, for example, like the actor-observer bias, where we're very sensitive to our own behavior, focus on the outlier here. I might learn to be convinced that my enjoyment of a thing is tied to the external pressure, not the internal motivation. For example, if I was being paid to play bass, again, as far as the actor observer bias goes, we might say, no, I'm playing bass because of the situational or the external, not the dispositional or the internal, right? It doesn't always happen this way, but it can, and that's the important part of the overjustification effect. But again, we're very susceptible when we start introducing external rewards as opposed to using our intrinsic driver. Essentially, we tend to give more weight, again, to these external justifications than to the internal ones. Let's look at Lepper, Green, and Nisbet's 1973 study on this. So they had a group of participants. They were preschoolers between 3 to 5 years old, who were given a set of markers to play with. 3 conditions were established: an expected award, an unexpected award, and no reward at all. So the expected award condition, these were kids that were told that they would receive a good player award from the experimenter if they drew some pictures with pens. In the unexpected award condition, they were given the award after playing with pens, but they were not told about it ahead of time. And when it came to the no award condition, again, this is just the control group. There was no pre-test in this because we had a lot of control in the test, but when it came to this group, again, it's the control group. We did nothing with them. Again, the dependent variable here, yeah. As we will see, the dependent variable will be the intrinsic versus extrinsic response to this. So the result of this experiment, kids who expected a reward, so again, this condition 1, they spent less time playing than the other 2 groups, right? They would just play because they knew they could get a reward, and they planned and they're done. Awarded kids, they use the pens in order to get the reward, rather than because they enjoyed using them. They made an external attribution for the behavior, not an internal one. So again, the children who already expected an award, they just played to play, or they just played for the reward. They did not play to play. They made an external attribution, and that was that. So if we look at the graph here, when it came to the percent of time spent playing, the expected award condition, that first condition, they spent by far the least amount of time playing. The unexpected award children, the ones who were given an award after playing with the pens, but they weren't told about it ahead of time, they played for much longer, and they played for essentially the same amount of time as the no reward group. And the fundamental takeaway here, just like we talked about, is that overjustification undermines natural enjoyment. Again, when you start introducing that extrinsic motivation as the primary driver, you lose the drive, effectively. Okay, so we understand the social self as a broad concept. We understand the looking glass self. We understand self-perception theory, and we understand the overjustification effect. Let's look at the self-concept, right? We're going to look at the multiple selves and self-discrepancy theory. So the self-concept is our subjective story of who we are. It is who we believe ourselves to be. It's not objective based on testable reality, so it can mix reality and fantasy. That's an important takeaway. Our version of ourselves is different in a scenario compared to how others might view us in that scenario. Obviously, we view ourselves with rose-colored lenses, and we're pretty biased, but our sense of self, situationally, can be based on ambitions, desires, and who knows what else. But the point is, again, we have our subjective story of who we are. Others believe us to be either the same thing or something else, but we have a version of ourselves that we think others believe us to be and who we think we are. Okay. Higgins expanded the self-concept. They introduced this idea of the actual self, the ideal self, and the ought self. So the actual self is who you believe you are now. It is your real, true, core self-concept. Of course, this can vary from context to context, just like we discussed up top, but it's who you believe you are. The ideal self is who you want to be, and the ought self is who you is who you believe others expect you to be. Right? So we have the actual self, who you are, the ideal self, who you want to be, and the ought self, who you believe others expect you to be. Higgins said that the more that these line up, the better that we feel. However, we can feel some tension if there's a mismatch. This idea of feeling this mismatch when there's tension in our self-concept is the self-discrepancy theory. The idea essentially states that if our actual self and our ideal self don't line up, we can be sad or depressed. When our actual self, right, who we believe we are, and who others, and our ought self, who others believe us to be, don't line up, we can feel anxiety or guilt. Yeah. So many people strive to align all three of these selves. This version of alignment where we have all three of these things lined up and we actively work towards that. That is called it's called having self-concept clarity. Self-concept clarity is the alignment among the three selves that's created psychological stability. Yeah. So that's the self-concept. All right, let's look at this. Self-presentation. So again, we've looked at the social self, we've looked at the looking glass self, we've looked at self-perception theory, we've looked at the over-justification effect, and we've looked at the multiple selves and self-concept and self-discrepancy theory. So now let's look at self-presentation. So we play and fulfill different roles depending on different situations, right? We know this. We play our student in class role, our child with family role, our friends at the bar role. And self-presentation is a part of that. It is a process in which we at least try to control how others perceive us by adjusting our presentation. And this is a cyclical process, so we adjust how others see us. Then we interpret the reactions of others based on those adjustments, and then we make more adjustments, yada, yada, yada. So I think that's pretty clear. But what's the motive for doing this, right? This adjusting of the self. And these aren't mutually exclusive, but this is the important takeaway. There are essentially four driving motivations for self-presentation. There's goal achievement. There is identity strengthening / self-verification. There is identity construction, and there is exploration, right? So we'll go through all of these. The goal achievement motivation for self-presentation states that we are tailoring impression to get what we want, right? We want to adjust ourselves so that we can have better things in life. This is like a dating profile, for example, right? Or going on a first date and trying to curate what we present as to get what we want. So goal achievement is a part of self-presentation. Identity strengthening and self-verification, that's another point in self-presentation, just like we talked about. Sometimes we behave in ways that confirm what we think we are like. We are trying to strengthen our identity and verify who we are. This might not be for another person. We might be presenting a certain way to validate and strengthen our own identity. Right? Self-verification theory holds that people have a need to seek confirmation of their self-concepts, even at the expense of self-enhancement. This is true. So we do crave that confirmation to a degree. But again, it doesn't have to be entirely related to other people. So we have our goal achievement motivation for self-presentation. We have our identity strengthening or self-verification motivation. And then we have identity construction. Right. Sometimes we present in a certain way aspirationally, making self-claims that motivate us to become that person. Again, similar to what we just talked about, we might be aware that the way we're presenting isn't true to who we are, but it's who we want to be. So we continue to live up to that expectation of ourselves. That is identity construction. We are constructing an identity for ourselves to portray so that we can kind of shape ourselves into that. So that was goal achievement, identity strengthening / self-verification, identity construction, and then we have exploration. Sometimes we present in different ways just to try on different selves, right? Especially online, we see a lot of that. Yeah. We're gonna get into some self-monitoring theory here, uh, but I'm just gonna grab a water bottle. So sit tight for like 20 seconds. Okay. So we have our water. I'm trying to go a little bit slower here because I'd gotten a comment and it made me sad. So now I'm trying to appease that person. Anywho, individual differences, right? Self-monitoring. So self-monitoring, at least according to Snyder in 1987, self-monitoring is the extent someone relies on external versus internal cues to guide behavior. So we'll explore this, but we kind of have this balance. Well, it's actually not a balance. It's different kinds of people. They kind of act from a different place. Some people are high in self-monitoring. Some people are low in self-monitoring. People that are high in self-monitoring, they can adjust behavior to come across differently more at will than low self-monitoring people, right? They care about how others perceive them. It's all tied to self-perception. They're very skilled at reading situations and adopting the persona as such. Again, they're very reliant on these external cues to guide behavior. Low self-monitoring people are guided very much by the internal. They act from an inner state point of view, and they're really less concerned with image. They kind of move at their own pace type thing, not really impeded upon by others. The self-presentation cycle that we had talked about, where we adjust how we see ourselves to elicit a specific perception, and then we interpret other people's reactions, and then we go back and forth with that. That is more easily manipulated by people with high self-monitoring. Again, they are actively making adjustments to come across differently in different situations and kind of conform to the environment around them. What are some results of these things? Of high self-monitoring or low self-monitoring. People that are high self-monitors, they are associated with being more likely to be a leader, having more dating partners, and tend to be more likely to choose their relationship partners based on looks. Of course, this is not guaranteed, but it's a somewhat correlation, I suppose. People with low self-monitoring, they tend to be more likely to pick partners for personality and show less situated chameleon behavior, right? We understand that. It's essentially the idea behind this self-monitoring. They don't really rely much on that external to guide behavior and shape who they are. Let's grab some water. So, Leon Festinger's social comparison theory. Just a reminder, so far we've gone through the social self as a broad concept. We specified the looking glass self, self-perception theory, the overjustification effect, self-concept and self-disciplinary theory, self-presentation, and individual differences that we see in self-monitoring. And now we are looking at social comparison theory. So social comparison theory is the process of, well, it speaks on the process of comparing ourselves to others in order to judge the self. So it's sort of like a juxtaposition to self-perception theory, where in self-perception theory we are observing our own behaviors to judge ourselves. In social comparison theory, we are observing others' behaviors, comparing ourselves to those behaviors in order to judge the self. So the core mechanism here is that we seek to assess with objective metrics, right? We seek to assess other people's, the comparison that we're making between us and others with something concrete, something that's physical, something that's a little bit more tangible. It doesn't have to literally be physical, but it's something that's demonstrable. Uh, yeah. Uh, sorry. Okay. So let me backtrack a little bit. Generally, we seek to assess with objective metrics. We seek to assess ourselves with objective metrics, right? When we assess ourselves, we want to do it with something tangible, something concrete, but sometimes the situation doesn't provide for that. And when it doesn't provide for that, we compare with others, we engage in this social comparison theory in order to evaluate ourselves. We prefer and are generally motivated when it comes to social comparison to pick similar targets to ourselves for the purpose of accuracy. Again, we want to compare for legitimate comparison. We don't want to compare ourselves to a billionaire. What's the point? We want to compare to somebody that's in our cohort, adjacent to us in some way. Sometimes there is a self-esteem motive to this, and we'll talk about that. But generally, we want that accuracy. But again, just to reiterate that, remember from earlier chapters, there's always that interplaying battle between the need to be accurate and the need to protect the self and prioritize self-esteem. So, we understand the core mechanism behind social comparison, but what are the motives? So the motives in social comparison are things like improvement or feeling better about the self, right? So when you're motivated by improvement, you will usually engage in upward comparisons, right? This is the unidirectional drive upward. When motivated to improve, we will sometimes feel the desire to compare to someone doing better than us. This is an upward social comparison. When the opposite is true, when we feel good, when we want to feel good or better about ourselves, we will usually make a downward comparison, right? Compare to worse off other people. Sometimes we feel motivated by self-esteem, and then we will compare to someone doing worse than us, right? This is a downward social comparison. We generally tend to compare upwards and not downwards, right? We want to be improving ourselves. We don't want to just be picking on the little guy or the guy who's worse than us. However, sometimes in doing that, we feel bad about ourselves, and to bring ourselves back up, we might downward compare in order to feel better, right? So we generally want to make that upward comparison, focus on that improvement, but if it seems out of reach, or it's making us feel bad about ourselves, we might resort to the next best thing, which is a downward comparison, comparing ourselves to our fellow man or our fellow woman, and that is unfortunate. But we do it to feel better. Okay, so automatic comparisons, right? We don't always get to choose when and who we compare to. Comparisons often happen automatically. Again, we don't always choose the target. There are individual differences in the frequency when it comes to this, right? Some people just don't really compare to others much. Yeah. Similarity matters in that too. Right, so we'll make our automatic comparison to make some kind of evaluation, whether it's downward or it's upward. But the similarity is key. So if we make an upward comparison and we're very similar to the person, the assimilation effect will happen, which causes us to feel better about ourselves, right? If we make an upward comparison but we're nothing at all like these people, the contrast effect will happen. We will feel worse about ourselves. If we make a downward comparison and we're very similar to them, we will get the contrast effect again, right? We will feel worse about ourselves if naturally if we're like the people that we're comparing ourselves to on a downward level. If we are like them, we will feel worse. But if we make a downward comparison and we're not similar to them, we'll get the assimilation effect. We'll feel better about ourselves, right? At least we're not them type thing. So I think we understand social comparison theory there. Self-esteem. So self-esteem, it's a big part of everything that we've been talking about so far. Self-esteem is considered the broad evaluation of the self. It's how much we like, respect, and find ourselves generally worthy. It's often measured on a 10-item scale, measuring levels of agreement. Right? Questions like and answers like on the whole, I am satisfied with myself, agree or disagree. At times I think I am no good at all, agree or disagree, 10 times. These questions usually, and this isn't too important by the way, but these questions usually are paired off and they're sectioned off in twos. People who agree with the first one are usually going to disagree with the second one. And that's just the point. But as far as self-esteem goes, let's look at some correlational effects here. So one is the self-serving judgment. That's a piece of self-esteem. So again, the self-serving judgment. We talked about self-serving bias a little bit. It's literally the same thing with a different word. We talked about that in different chapters, I think. We attribute our successes internally and we attribute our failures externally. And in addition to that, we will recall successes easier than failures. Yeah, so that's the self-serving judgment, very big part of self-esteem. People higher in self-esteem tend to be correlated with self-serving judgments. But the question is someone high in self-esteem because of self-serving judgments, or does somebody make self-serving judgments because they have high self-esteem? Which one came first? We don't really know. It could be similar to self-serving prophecy in a way, where there could be some social priming, but ultimately we have no idea. It's important to remember that this is correlational, though. Again, just like with most of the things we've talked about, high self-esteem people just tend to be better at making these self-serving judgments. But people with low self-esteem can as well. It's just less natural and less statistically common. So I think we understand self-esteem here. Oh, you know what? I missed a thing. Just in self-esteem, when it comes to self-esteem and social comparison, people lower in self-esteem are less likely to make an upward comparison. They're more likely to make a downward comparison. However, these comparisons they can be automatic or forced on us. And so these low self-esteem individuals can still be harmed by upward exposure despite the fact that they're less likely to make them. Again, the issue with choosing to make a downward comparison to avoid the harm of an upward one is that we don't always choose our targets, right? Comparisons can be automatic, and social media plays a role in this too. And that's what we're going to get into in a second here. Let me just correct my note. Yeah, pretty interesting chapter. Okay. So we understand self-esteem. We understand social comparison, right? Comparing ourselves to others in order to judge the self. We understand our self-monitoring, right? As far as our high and low self-monitoring goes and the idea of those. We understand self-perception as far as, our tendency to fulfill and play different roles depending on a situation. Being motivated by goal achievement, identity strengthening, identity construction, and exploration. We understand our self-concept and self-discrepancy theory, with our self-concept being, our subjective story of who we are and having that actual self, ideal self, and ought self, and that discrepancy, and, if the actual self and ideal self don't match, and if the actual and the ought self don't match. And then we had looked at the justification effect, right? That's That's the whole external rewards versus intrinsic motivation thing, right? We looked at self-perception a little bit, self-perception theory. Uh, this was us learning about ourselves by observing our own behavior, and we had the looking glass self, internalizing how we think others judge us to integrate those appraisals into our own self-concept. Yeah. Um, so, let's look at social media and self-esteem for a second. So this is the broad idea, okay? We share all these nice little tidbits of our life on social media, and it's all in trying to show everyone how great our little life is, right? The question is, how much upward comparison are we making to people whose lives seem better than us? People closer to reaching what they're comparing to, just like we said before, will feel good about those comparisons, but the people who aren't as close to achieving those things won't feel great. And social media has a pretty big effect on this, especially when it comes to upward comparison. Let's look at it. So, um, this study in particular, our professor was involved. We saw 213 undergrads, primarily female, around age 19, come into a lab. Trait self-esteem was evaluated with a 10-point scale that we talked about earlier, right? So trait self-esteem are our long-standing traits and characteristics. Uh, Then people scrolled past the first 20 social media posts that they came across when they opened a social media application. They were asked if they made comparisons upward or downward to see to what they were seeing and how it made them feel. State self-esteem, or our moment-to-moment self-esteem, right, depending on the state we're in, was then evaluated. So again, everybody logged each comparison, right? If they made an up or down comparison, they made their self-evaluations, and pre-scroll trait self-esteem and post-scroll state self-esteem were both compared. The findings is that more upward comparisons were made than downward comparisons on both Instagram and Facebook. The higher people's trait self-esteem were, the less extreme each comparison was. Again, a lot of comparisons were being made, but if your self-esteem was higher, you'd perceive the distance between you and a person as smaller. Then, that impacted state self-esteem. People with higher self-esteem felt better after making a comparison because it wasn't as extreme. It wasn't as upward. Also, as we understand, the higher your self-esteem, the fewer your number of upward comparisons. As such, you felt better at the end of the process because you generally made less comparisons, and so did all of the people in the study. The finding here, if we look at the graph again, substantially more number of comparisons in Facebook versus Instagram. The finding is key because before social media it was the case that higher self-esteem people made less upward comparisons, right? It was all about being humble. But now with social media, in this context where comparisons are hard to avoid, that habit maintains itself. People with lower self-esteem make more frequent and more extreme social comparisons, which often result in even lower self-evaluations, and this just keeps going. Yeah. So I'm just trying to read the little triangle that she set up here. I think I probably covered it in the results breakdown, but just the way that this is formatted makes me unhappy. Anywho, the big picture connections here, right? There's a feedback loop. Others' labels influence your self-concept, influence your behavior, influence further labeling. Ambiguity matters in the self-concept and the social self, right? Self-perception kicks in when attitudes aren't clear. Rewards can backfire by crowding out intrinsic motivation. We see an element of role play here, an element of adaptation. Self-presentation, self-monitoring show the self is strategic and flexible. We see a comparison. We see that comparison is a double-edged sword. It can fuel growth when controlled and upward and close, and even downward to a degree, but it can hurt self-esteem, especially online in most demographics. And we see the modern challenge here, right? Social media makes upward comparisons easy and constant, impacting vulnerable users. So I think we understand this first topic here. Everybody is free to click off. We'll be going and looking at the textbook in just a second here. Just a minute. Okay, so let's look at the textbook content here. What can we take away? This was an interesting part of the self concept. We had talked about self schemas. This was the fact that people organize information about themselves into schemas. We understand what schemas are. They're knowledge structures, and in this case, it's knowledge structures about the self that help people understand, explain, predict, and reflect on their own behavior, including attitudes, their likes and dislikes, and personality traits. Right? We have our idea of the self all stored in these schemas. The issue with that, as we understand, is that schemas can bias memory processes, and our desire to see ourselves positively can influence which of our past actions we actually remember. And this was seen in a study at the University of Waterloo. Uh, Zivakunda and colleagues found that our desire to see ourselves in a positive light can actually influence which of our past actions we're most likely to remember. In one of the studies done, participants were told that introversion is associated with professional success. In others, they were told that extroversion is associated with success. All participants were then asked to list behaviors they had performed that were relevant to the dimensions of introversion and extroversion. Those who were led to believe that introversion was associated with success were more likely to remember being introverted rather than extroverted as far as their performed behaviors go. The opposite was true for those who were led to believe that extroversion was associated with success. According to the researchers, when people are motivated to see themselves as possessing a desired quality or trait, they conduct what is called a selective memory search for examples of past behaviors consistent with that trait. This body of evidence then allows for them to draw a rational conclusion that the desirable trait is part of their self-schema. If we're recalling introverted behaviors and are more likely and led to believe that introversion is a superior trait, we are more likely to see ourselves as introverts. Yeah. I think we had talked about self-concept clarity a little bit. Uh, There was a study done, and I don't know if we mentioned this, but people with low self concept clarity tend to have lower self esteem and are more depressed and neurotic. Uh, the opposite is true when it comes to high concept clarity, right? Um, Low concept clarity also tends to see happiness being more correlated with material and status opposed to anything else, right? Um, as we talked about, high self concept clarity can lead to many different positive benefit elements of our lives. This is an interesting thing, just on the topic of self concept clarity. Still, higher self concept clarity tends to be more so correlated with people from individualist cultures as opposed to collectivist cultures. The sense of self might be less clear in cultures in which the self is perceived as interdependent. In fact, even within one country, another study found that Koreans living in Vancouver reported lower self-concept clarity than European Canadians living in the same city. Right? So we see this another cultural difference in self-concept clarity. Individualist cultures catering to it more. Just a second. Yeah, sorry, I'll try to get through this. When it comes to the ways that we define ourselves culturally, we see that people who grew up in Western cultures tend to have a more independent view of the self, meaning you define yourselves in terms of your own thoughts, feelings, and actions, and not in terms of uh, the thoughts, feelings, and actions of others. While collectivist cultures tend to have a more interdependent view of the self, where connectedness and interdependence between people are valued and important, and uniqueness in particular is more so frowned upon. Of course, this is not true for everybody, just like everything else, but it's a case of being more likely or not. When it comes to the gender differences and how we define ourselves, still focusing on this idea of self concept. Women tend to reflect more relational interdependence in their self concept, meaning that they focus more on their close relationships, such as how they feel about their romantic partner or their child. When women are asked to describe a positive or negative emotional event in their lives, they tend to mention relationship events as becoming engaged or the death of a family member, whatever it may be. So women are more relational in their sense of self, their self concept. Men, on the other hand, uh, they are higher in collective interdependence, meaning that they tend to define themselves in terms of social groups such as sports teams and what they which they belong to. So, when asked to describe a positive or negative emotional event in their lives, men are more likely to talk about events involving larger groups, such as the time that they were part of a sports team or when they were in a band, whatever it may be. So, again, as far as the cultural differences go, Western cultures. Uh, More individualized cultures tend to be they tend to have more of an independent view of the self, and those interdependent collectivist cultures tend to have a more dependent view uh, of the self, right? Something a little bit more interdependent. What else do we got? Okay. So let's talk about self-knowledge, introspection, and a little bit of self-awareness. Introspection, yeah. So introspection is a key part of self-knowledge, knowing the self. It's a process where people look inward and examine their own thoughts, feelings, and motivations. Um, this is how we think about ourselves, right? It's how we discover new things about ourselves. The interesting, or at least two interesting things about introspection, is that we don't rely on that kind of information as much as you think. And even when we do it, the true reasons for feelings and behavior can be hidden from conscious awareness anyway. So it's definitely introspection is definitely a piece of learning about the self, right? A piece of gaining self knowledge, but it's iffy. Uh, Self awareness theory. Did we talk about this? Just so I can check. No. Yeah. So self awareness theory, that's a piece of self knowledge. It's essentially this idea of, when people focus on themselves, they evaluate and compare their current behavior to their internal standards and values. In short, it's when we become self conscious in the sense that we become objective, judgmental observers of ourselves, seeing ourselves as an outside observer would, and we can have positive and negative self awareness in the same way, right? You let's say you're a smoker and you recognize that smoking is bad, and you see yourself smoking in the reflection of a mirror and you look like shit. There will be a disparity between behavior and internal standard, right? This is that cognitive dissonance that we were talking about. Um, you might then change behavior to match your internal change of which would make everything feel okay, which would be positive self-awareness. Again, you engage in this judgment of yourself, and you make a positive change. However, if you feel like you can't, then being in the state of self-awareness and feeling uncomfortable due to the confrontation of disagreement could be painful, and this is the negative part of self-awareness, right? When this happens, you're then forced to either escape or confront the behavior for the better. But yeah, you definitely try to escape when it comes to negative self-awareness. It's important to remember, though, again, not all self-awareness escape even is damaging. Sometimes people escape through positive means, right? Like they'll escape from negative self-awareness through things like religion or being in a flow state on a project. Self-focus and self-awareness is not always unpleasant either. Focusing on yourself after success can feel great. Self-focus can also remind you of right and wrong and help learning with your mistakes. And studies even show that people who are self-aware, like being in front of a mirror and looking at yourself, tend to be more likely to follow a good moral standard. Yeah, ultimately, self-awareness can have positive or negative effects, and in those cases in which self-awareness feels aversive, those bad feelings can be alleviated in either a constructive or deconstructive or destructive manner. Uh, Cultural differences in self-awareness, right? This is a big piece of the pie. East Asian cultures tend to practice an outside perspective of the self, focusing on how others see them, while Westerners tend to prioritize a more insider perspective, focusing on private experiences and less so how others see them. East Asians, as such, are typically more self aware, even chronically so, because they're always thinking of themselves through the eyes of others. Yeah. Um, Yeah. So this is an interesting study. Essentially, both American and Japanese students. Just to touch on that cultural difference in self-awareness. Um, Both Japanese and American students were asked to review a questionnaire about the self in front of a mirror. When it came to American students, because they generally tend to be more internalized, more insider, have a more insider perspective in their self-awareness, care less about how other people view them in that sense, less focused on the community, more on them as an individual. When they didn't have a mirror in front of them, uh, they they were pretty satisfied with themselves, or at least in comparison to when they did it in front of a mirror, they were much more satisfied. So when American students were put in front of a mirror and they filled out this questionnaire about the self and they looked at themselves, they tended to be less satisfied. But when they didn't have to do that, they tended to be more satisfied. On the other hand, when it came to the Japanese students, their satisfaction didn't change, mirror or not. What could also help here? I think we understand intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. I think we understand the overjustification effect, so we don't have to review that. Yeah, the looking glass self, I think we're pretty good on the textbook content. Hmm, this is interesting. Just on the topic of self-control. Um, I don't think there was anything on this in the lecture material, so I just want to go over this. As far as self-control goes, self-control is the executive function of the self. It serves to regulate people's behavioral choices and plans for the future. Self-control is a huge part of doing that, right? Self-control is the ability to subdue immediate desires, like wanting to take a nap, to achieve a long-term goal instead. We're able to think ahead here, which is something that's unique to humans, set a goal and regulate behaviors in a way to make that happen, right? It's important to note that it's not helpful to avoid temptation by not thinking about those temptations. It's not helpful to think about long-term goals and how important they are to us without doing anything. Instead, just like this self-control idea says, we want to arrange our environment in a way where we can avoid temptation, be well rested, and form specific implementation intentions in advance of the goal. Meaning, as far as implementation intentions goes, that's speaking on how, a specific plan or how we will achieve a thing. Research on self-regulation, regulatory resource model suggests, research on the self-regulatory resource model suggests that we have a limited amount of energy to devote to exercise self-control. We have this kind of mental energy, and it acts as a resource. Uh, if we have none of it, we can make worse decisions, and this is called the depletion effect. Uh, this idea of energy and self-control is all related to cognitive load. Cognitive load theory, in this case, is the idea that people's true attitudes emerge when their cognitive resources are taxed in some way, when they have this depletion effect. Uh, Therefore, it's more complicated to control your responses, and your brain is occupied with doing a complex task, and therefore you do you. So thought suppression, in this case, is much like self-control in that they both take up mental resources. Uh, right? We have this depletion effect that can ruin our self-control and lead to worse decisions. And at the same time, the cognitive load theory suggests that we suppress who we really are until we experience that depletion effect, until our mental resources are taken up, and then it's the real us. Yeah, I think we understand primarily downward and upward social comparison. Yeah, the what could be worth all of your time? I guess just to touch on social comparison, we like to engage in relationship comparisons as well. Where we see how our romantic relationship stacks up to somebody else's, um, and we make those upward or downward comparisons. Right, the effect of upward and downward comparisons differ depending on the kind of thoughts that they trigger, though. So, when it comes to upward comparisons, if hearing about your friend's great relationship inspires you, the effects are positive. You'll feel happier about your relationship and yourself. You'll also be less likely to check out alternative partners. However, if hearing about your friend's great relationship triggers negative thoughts, the opposite happens. When it comes to downward comparisons, if you're checking out your friend's Instagram or Facebook and decide that their relationship isn't as good as yours, the research shows that in this situation, people tend to be glad that their relationship is better than their friends. In other words, the downward comparison here triggers more positive thoughts about your own relationship. But just like all things, social comparison is even cultural. European Canadians are more motivated to upward motivational comparison. Um, while Asian Canadians are the opposite. Asian Canadians prefer downward comparison. The research suggests that people from collectivist cultures are more concerned with avoiding failure than with achieving success, whereas just the opposite is true in individualist cultures. This is because of social things, right? Collectivist cultures seeking self-improvement to a greater extent than individual cultures, yada yada yada. Let's talk about a couple more of these. I know we're running very long today. But I wanted to look at the sociometer theory. So, uh, essentially, a question was asked, right? What's the purpose of self-esteem? Where does it come from? According to Mark Larry, human beings have a fundamental need to maintain relationships with others. In our evolutionary past, the chances of survival would be greatly increased if we belonged to a social group. Being rejected by the group would have disastrous consequences, and as such, we developed a mechanism referred to as the sociometer to do that, or the sociometer. According to the sociometer theory, self-esteem operates as a gauge that monitors how much we're accepted or rejected by others. It is a metric of our relationship quality with other people. When we are valued and accepted, our self-esteem rises. When we're devalued and rejected, it drops. When others reject us, it is a signal to restore our relationships. So this is all the sociometer theory. People who are chronically low in self-esteem tend to experience more rejection. People who are chronically low in self-esteem tend to expect rejection, uh, and people chronically high in self-esteem tend to expect that they will be accepted by others. So that's the sociometer theory. We have some self-enhancement theory and some self-verification theory here. We had talked about self-verification a little bit, right? Self-verification is it was our identity strengthening when it came to self-preservation, right? Our tendency to behave in ways that confirm what we think we're like. But let's expand on that and let's talk about self-enhancement. So, one way of feeling good about ourselves is to distort or exaggerate positive qualities. This is known as self-enhancement. On the contrary, sometimes we want other people to tell it like it is so that we develop an accurate picture of who we are. That is self-verification. Consequently, it seems we are caught between wanting to view ourselves in the most positive possible light and wanting an accurate assessment of what we are really like. So self-enhancement is wanting to feel good about ourselves regardless of the facts. Right? Self-enhancement, regardless of if we are actually a certain way, we just want to feel good. We have that need to feel good about ourselves, and so we might hold unrealistically positive views, but that actually helps us. It helps us feel better. It's important to realize that self-enhancement is more prevalent in Western cultures than collectivist cultures, yes, but everybody does it, right? We all have this need to feel good about ourselves. In collectivist cultures, people tend to be more self-critical. This is called self-effacement, and this develops at a young age. But again, we all have this tendency and this balancing between self-enhancement and self-verification, where self-enhancement is wanting to feel good about ourselves regardless of the facts, and self-verification is wanting to know the truth about ourselves. Regardless of if it's flattering. What else do we got here? We looked at a Stinson study looking at self-verification, and it said that high self-esteem people had more clarity and certainty about who they were when they were asked to recall times when they were complimented, rather than recall times that they were criticized, right? They had more clarity and certainty in remembering those times they were complimented. They also had more self-concept clarity and certainty when they were given positive rather than negative feedback, when they had an interaction with a Confederate who was trained to behave in a warm rather than cold manner. Low self-esteem people, on the other hand, showed the opposite effect. They had a clear, more certain sense of self when they were recalling criticisms and received negative feedback or had an interaction with a Confederate who behaved in a cold manner. The additional limits that we have on the need to self-verify is that people strive to uphold negative self-beliefs only when they are certain of them. If the consequences of being improperly valued are not too great, for example, if your contact with these individuals is insufficient, then even people with negative or positive negative views prefer positive feedback. Right, so even if your self-esteem is lower and you tend to prioritize the criticisms of you, if the consequences of being improperly evaluated don't really matter, even then we want positive feedback. And if people feel like there's nothing that they can do to improve themselves, they generally prefer positive feedback to accurate feedback. Yeah, so that's pretty much it. That was a long one, and we'll see you in the next one.